rainy day at the bakery. Rain fell softly against the windows of Willow and Whisk Bakery. The sky was gray and the streets were empty. Puddles covered the ground, and the sound of the rain filled the air. Inside the bakery, it was warm and bright. The smell of fresh bread and sweet pastries filled the room. Clara, the baker, was busy behind the counter. She wore a soft sweater and a blue apron. She loved rainy mornings because they made the bakery feel even cozier. On the windowsill, her big orange cat, Mr. Poppy, stretched and curled up again. He watched the rain with half-closed eyes. Clara carefully placed warm loaves of bread on the shelves. She lit small candles on the tables, making the bakery glow. The bell over the door jingled. "Good morning, Clara," said Mrs. Maple, holding a wet umbrella. She wore a bright red scarf. "Good morning, Mrs. Maple. You're brave to come out in this rain," Clara said with a smile. "Oh, I can't miss my morning tea and scone," Mrs. Maple chuckled. Clara poured her a hot cup of tea and gave her a warm blueberry scone. The rain fell harder outside, but inside, it was peaceful. Suddenly, the bell above the door rang. Standing in the doorway was Oliver, the local farmer. His brown coat was soaked and his boots left small puddles on the floor. He carried a wooden basket covered with a damp cloth. "Oh, Oliver, you must be freezing. Come in and warm up," Clara said with a smile. Oliver chuckled and stepped inside. "It's pouring out there, but I thought you might like these." He pulled back the cloth to reveal jars of golden honey and a pile of fresh berries. Drops of rain still clung to the fruit. Clara's eyes lit up. "Oh, Oliver, these are beautiful. Fresh honey and berries are just what I needed today." Oliver wiped rain from his face. "Thought you might make something sweet, something warm for a day like this." Clara smiled softly. "Yes, I think I'll bake a honeyberry loaf, something soft, sweet, and comforting." Mrs. Maple, sitting with her tea, perked up. "Oh, that sounds wonderful, dear." Oliver grinned. "I'll stay for a slice when it's ready." Clara tied her apron and got to work. She carefully mixed flour, honey, and berries in a big wooden bowl. The sound of her whisk mixed with the soft patter of rain on the roof. Soon, the bakery was filled with the smell of honey and fresh berries baking in the oven. The air felt even warmer and cozier. Outside, the rain began to fall harder. The sky grew darker. Inside, Clara was pulling the warm honeyberry loaf from the oven when the lights flickered. Then everything went dark. The oven went quiet. The soft music stopped. "Oh," Clara gasped, holding the loaf carefully. Mrs. Maple looked up from her tea. "Oh dear, a power cut?" Clara nodded, placing the loaf on the counter, but she didn't panic. Clara moved calmly, pulling candles from a shelf. She lit one after another, placing them on the tables and counters. The bakery glowed with soft, golden light. Mr. Poppy, the big orange cat, stretched and purred by the window. "It's even cozier now," Clara said with a smile. The customers agreed. The candlelight flickered, making the bakery feel like a safe, quiet place. The smell of fresh bread and honey filled the warm air. Suddenly, the bell above the door rang. A man stood in the doorway. His jacket was thin and soaked, and water dripped from his clothes. His shoes made wet sounds as he stepped inside. His face looked tired and cold. "Oh dear, you must be freezing. Come in, please," Clara said kindly. The man slowly nodded and stepped inside. "Here, sit by the fire," Clara said, pointing to a chair near the small fireplace. The man sat down, and Clara quickly brought him a soft towel. "Dry yourself off. I'll bring you something warm," she said softly. The man took the towel with shaking hands. Mrs. Maple leaned closer to Clara and whispered, "Poor boy, he looks like he's been walking in this rain for hours." Clara soon returned with a hot cup of tea and a thick slice of warm honeyberry loaf. "Here, this will help," Clara said, placing the food in front of him. The man hesitated for a moment, but slowly took a sip of the tea. Then he took a small bite of the sweet bread. His shoulders relaxed a little. Clara smiled warmly. "I'm Clara, and this is Mrs. Maple." The man looked up and gave a small nod. "I'm Daniel." "Well, Daniel," Clara said softly, "you're safe here." Daniel looked around. The soft candlelight, the smell of bread, and the quiet sound of the rain made the bakery feel warm and safe. After a few moments, Daniel began to speak. "I didn't always travel like this," Daniel said quietly. "I used to live in the next town. My family had a little shop. We sold books and small things. My sister loved working there. It wasn't much, but it was home." Daniel stared into the fire. "Then, my sister got very sick. The doctors didn't think it was serious, but she didn't get better. The shop got quieter and she got weaker." Mrs. Maple's smile faded. She listened carefully. Daniel's voice softened. "One morning I woke up, and she was gone. She left me a note. It said she didn't want to be a burden. She wanted to travel and see the world." He sighed and shook his head slowly. "I've been looking for her ever since. Every town, every shop. I stop in places like this because she loved warm, cozy spots. I always hope maybe she'll walk in." The bakery was quiet. Only the rain and the soft crackling of the fire could be heard. Clara placed a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You must be very tired. Have you been walking in the rain all this time?" Daniel nodded slowly. "I didn't plan to come here. The rain pushed me off the road. I just kept going." Clara gave him a soft smile. "Well, you're here now, and you're not alone anymore. Rest as long as you need." Mrs. Maple raised her teacup. "If your sister loves places like this, I'm sure she'd be happy knowing you found one." Daniel gave a small smile. "Thank you. This feels like home, even if it's just for today." Clara looked around at the warm, glowing bakery. She watched Mr. Poppy sleeping by the window, the flickering candles, and the quiet customers enjoying their tea and bread. She smiled. That's what this bakery is for. As the rain poured, more people wandered in, looking for shelter. Clara's little bakery slowly filled with quiet chatter. Clara looked around and clapped her hands. "Who wants to help me bake something new?" Mrs. Maple laughed. "Oh, I haven't baked in years, but I'd love to help." Daniel set down his tea. "I can help too." Even a little girl, Emily, who had come in with her mother, raised her hand excitedly. Clara smiled. Perfect, let's bake something special. She handed out aprons. Mrs. Maple helped mix dough in a big bowl. Daniel carefully lined a baking tray. Little Emily sprinkled sugar on cookies. The bakery filled with laughter and the soft sounds of mixing and baking. Outside, the rain fell harder, but no one seemed to mind. Soon, the smell of fresh cookies and bread filled the room again. Clara carefully placed warm treats on the counter for everyone to share. It's like a little family in here, Mrs. Maple said softly. Clara looked around at the smiling faces. Yes, she agreed, it really is. The rain outside showed no signs of stopping. It poured down harder and the sky grew darker. Inside the bakery, it was still warm and bright. The soft candlelight flickered and the smell of fresh bread and sweet pastries filled the air. Clara smiled as she looked around. Mrs. Maple was sipping her tea. Daniel sat quietly by the fire, and little Emily was drawing pictures on a napkin. Then Clara heard a soft scratching sound at the door. She turned toward the sound. "Did anyone hear that?" Clara asked softly. Everyone paused. Clara slowly walked to the door and opened it just a little. There, shivering on the doorstep, was a small, wet puppy. Its fur was soaked and it looked up at Clara with big, sad eyes. "Oh, you poor thing," Clara gasped. She quickly bent down and gently scooped up the little dog. It was cold and shaking. "Come on in," Clara whispered, holding it close to her chest. Mrs. Maple gasped. "Oh dear, the poor baby must have been out there for hours." Clara wrapped the puppy in a soft towel and placed it by the fire next to Mr. Poppy. The big orange cat lifted his head and stared at the puppy. The puppy gave a tiny sneeze and curled up in the towel. Mr. Poppy blinked slowly, gave a small purr, and rested his head back down. "He doesn't seem to mind," Clara said, smiling. Little Emily giggled. "Can we keep him?" Clara chuckled. "Let's dry him off first. Maybe he belongs to someone." Daniel leaned forward. "If not, maybe this bakery can be his home." Mrs. Maple nodded. "A bakery needs a dog and a cat." Clara smiled. "We'll see. For now, he's safe." The puppy let out a soft sigh and fell asleep next to the warm fire. The rain tapped softly on the windows, but inside the bakery felt warmer than ever. The bakery was calm, but Clara wanted to make it feel even cozier. Suddenly, the doorbell jingled again. A young man stepped in, shaking off his umbrella. He wore a thick scarf and carried a small case. Come in, get out of this rain," Clara called kindly. The man smiled shyly. "Thank you, it's really coming down out there." He glanced around and noticed the soft glow of the candles and the happy customers. "My name is Ben. I play music, and I thought maybe I could play a little here to brighten the mood." Clara's eyes lit up. "Oh, music would be perfect on a day like this. Please make yourself comfortable." Ben opened the small case and pulled out a wooden guitar. It looked old but well loved. He sat near the fire and began to play. Soft, gentle music filled the bakery. The sound of the guitar mixed with the steady rain tapping on the windows. Mrs. Maple smiled and swayed to the tune. Daniel leaned back, closing his eyes, letting the music wash over him. Little Emily clapped her hands quietly. The soft music made the bakery feel even warmer and more peaceful. Clara moved behind the counter, smiling as she watched everyone relax. Ben's music was slow and calming, like a lullaby. Even the puppy wagged its little tail in its sleep. The rain was cold and harsh outside, but inside the bakery felt like a warm hug. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and smiled. But then she noticed Mrs. Maple sitting quietly, looking out the window. Clara walked over. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Maple?" she asked softly. Mrs. Maple smiled a little, but looked sad. "Oh, it's nothing, dear. It's just... today is my birthday, and I forgot until now." Clara's eyes grew wide. "Your birthday? Oh, Mrs. Maple, we must celebrate." Mrs. Maple laughed softly. "Oh no, dear, I'm too old for all that. I didn't tell anyone, and the rain ruined my plans." Clara shook her head. "Nonsense. You're in the best place to celebrate. Give me just a minute." Clara quickly went behind the counter. She pulled out some flour, sugar, and eggs. She called out, "Would anyone like to help me bake something special for Mrs. Maple?" Little Emily clapped her hands. "Yes!" Daniel smiled. "I'll help." Even Ben stopped playing his guitar and walked over. Together they mixed batter and poured it into a pan. Clara added honey and berries on top. "It's going to be a small birthday cake," Clara said. Soon the sweet smell of cake filled the bakery. When it was ready, Clara placed it on the counter. She lit a single candle. Everyone gathered around. "Happy birthday, Mrs. Maple," they all cheered. Mrs. Maple covered her mouth, tears in her eyes. "Oh, you are all too kind," she whispered. "Make a wish," Clara smiled. Mrs. Maple closed her eyes and made a wish. Then she blew out the candle. Everyone clapped, and Clara sliced the warm cake for everyone to share. Mrs. Maple took a bite and smiled. "This is the best birthday I've had in years." After the birthday cake was eaten, the bakery grew quiet again. The soft rain still tapped on the windows, and the warm light from the candles flickered gently. Clara smiled as she cleaned the counter. Then, something caught her eye. An old book sat on a high shelf behind the counter. It was covered in dust. Clara carefully took it down. It was her grandmother's old recipe book. She flipped through the pages, smiling at the familiar recipes. But then, a small piece of folded paper slipped out and fell to the floor. Clara picked it up. It was a handwritten note. The paper was old and the ink was faded. It said, "Rainy day recipe for sharing warmth." Clara's eyes lit up. She had never seen this recipe before. It listed simple ingredients: flour, honey, cinnamon, and dried apples. At the bottom, her grandmother had written, "Bake this when hearts need warmth." Clara smiled to herself. This is perfect for today. She turned to the room. "Would anyone like to help me bake something special?" she asked. Everyone looked up. "Yes," Emily shouted. Daniel smiled and nodded. Mrs. Maple chuckled. Ben strummed his guitar softly. "I'll help too." Clara began gathering the ingredients. Emily carefully measured the flour. Daniel chopped the dried apples. Mrs. Maple mixed the honey and cinnamon. The bakery was filled with soft chatter and laughter. Soon the oven was warm again, and the smell of cinnamon and apples filled the air. When the bread was done, Clara sliced it and shared it with everyone. The warm, sweet bread made everyone smile. Clara looked at the recipe and whispered, "Thank you, Grandma." The rain fell softly outside, but inside, hearts were warm and full. Mr. Poppy stretched and purred by the fire. The little puppy was curled up next to him, sleeping soundly. Ben softly played his guitar again, the music blending with the sound of the rain. Clara looked around at her little bakery. Mrs. Maple was smiling as she sipped her tea. Daniel was laughing quietly with Emily, who showed him her drawings. Oliver, the farmer, had returned and was enjoying another slice of bread. Clara felt a warm feeling in her heart. It was still raining, but no one wanted to leave. Clara walked over to the window and watched the raindrops slide down the glass. Then she turned back to her guests. "You're all welcome to stay as long as you like," she said softly. Mrs. Maple smiled. "Oh, we're not going anywhere yet." Daniel looked at the puppy. "Maybe this little one needs a name." Emily clapped her hands. "Let's call him Biscuit." Everyone laughed. "Biscuit it is," Clara agreed with a smile. The little puppy wagged his tail in his sleep. Soon the rain began to slow. The sky turned a softer gray, and the village outside was quiet. Clara started to close the bakery for the night. She blew out the candles one by one, but the warmth in the room stayed. Everyone slowly began to leave, saying thank you and goodbye. Mrs. Maple hugged Clara gently. This was the best rainy day I could have asked for. Daniel smiled and shook Clara's hand. "Thank you for everything." Emily waved goodbye, holding her mother's hand. "Bye, Biscuit." Clara watched them go and then locked the door. She sat by the fire with Mr. Poppy and Biscuit beside her. The bakery was quiet now, but it still felt full. Clara smiled softly. The rain had brought everyone together, and tomorrow would bring another warm, cozy day.